It felt like we were finally getting a moment to breathe, maybe letting the dust settle a bit. But then this dropped, and once again, gun owners across the country find themselves shaking their heads, wondering what just happened, and maybe more importantly, why it happened the way it did. It's like we're in this constant loop where every time we think we're making progress, the rug gets pulled out from underneath us. And this time, it's not the usual suspects. This time, the disappointment is coming from someone a lot of people trusted. So here's what's going on. Just days ago, the Department of Justice finalized an internal agreement that basically stops enforcement of the previous classification of certain gun accessories, specifically the ones we all know have been caught in legal limbo for years now. The ATF had been seizing them left and right, claiming they were essentially illegal under federal law. We're talking about things like forced reset triggers, which for a long time were labeled as machine guns by default, even though a lot of us know that's just not how they work. Now, the DOJ has reversed course. Sounds like a win, right? I thought so too. Until I read the fine print. And then it hit me. We're being played, again. The headlines will tell you that this is a victory for the Second Amendment. They'll say that gun owners are finally getting their rights back, that property wrongfully taken is going to be returned, and that the government is correcting past mistakes. But you know how this game works. It's never that simple. Because while yes, some people will get their property back, many others won't. If you happen to live in one of the 16 states that challenge this move in court, guess what? You're not getting anything back. Those states filed lawsuits immediately after the settlement was made public, and in response, the ATF is now refusing to return the items to residents in those states. Instead, you'll get a letter saying your property can be destroyed or sent to someone else out of state. That's the choice. Take it or leave it. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a win to me. That sounds like selective justice. That sounds like we've just confirmed a two-tiered system where federal policy only applies if your state government agrees with it. And that's not how any of this is supposed to work. The federal government, whether we like it or not, is supposed to set the standard. States can add more restrictions, sure, but they can't override what the feds declare legal. At least, that's how it used to be. But lately, especially when it comes to firearms, it feels like the federal government is more than happy to let the states call the shots, literally. It's frustrating, because this was supposed to be the moment we turned a corner. After years of back and forth, of lawsuits, raids, confiscations, and endless confusion, we were finally seeing a unified decision. People were ready to move forward. Companies that had been dragged through the mud were finally getting a chance to do business again. Gun owners who had been treated like criminals were finally being acknowledged. And then, this. A carve-out. A backroom deal that gives anti-gun states exactly what they wanted. The right to ignore a federal decision and keep treating law-abiding citizens like felons. And what makes it worse is the timing. This didn't come from a court ruling. It wasn't the result of a lengthy trial or a decision handed down from the Supreme Court. This was a voluntary move, a settlement. It was something that could have been structured to protect everyone equally. But it wasn't, and I think that says a lot about where the priorities really are right now. Because if the goal was truly to defend the Second Amendment and restore trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect our rights, this isn't how you do it. You don't leave millions of gun owners out in the cold because they happen to live in states with different politics. You don't abandon them to avoid a legal fight. You stand up and you defend the Constitution for everyone. What really worries me is how quiet this all was. 1 minute, the ATF is aggressively enforcing what they believe to be illegal devices, sending letters, conducting raids, telling people they could be prosecuted. Then, all of a sudden, they pull back. No press conference, no clear explanation, just a quiet internal shift followed by a legal settlement. And it's not like the states didn't know it was coming. 16 of them were ready to file the moment it was announced, and when they did, they got exactly what they wanted, a carve-out. Not because a court told them they were right, but because the DOJ decided not to fight them. And you know what happens next. That carve-out will be used as a template. The next time there's a ruling in favor of gun rights, you can bet that certain states will demand their own exception. They'll claim they have special circumstances, that their local laws should override the federal decision. And if this administration isn't willing to push back now, Why would they later? It sets a dangerous tone. It tells anti-gun states that all they have to do is scream loud enough, and they'll get to keep their own rules, even if they contradict federal policy. It's not about the devices. Let's be honest. Most gun owners aren't walking around with forced reset triggers installed in their rifles. Many of us didn't even know what they were until the ATF made such a big deal out of them. But it's the principle that matters. It's the idea that if something is legal at the federal level, you shouldn't have to check your zip code to find out if you're going to be treated like a criminal for owning it. You shouldn't be punished because your state attorney general disagrees with Washington. But that's where we are. Now, I know there are people who will say, well, maybe this is just a legal tactic. Maybe the administration thought it was better to compromise than to drag this out in court. Maybe they wanted to avoid more lawsuits, more political fallout. I get that. But at what cost? Because every time we let politics override the Constitution, we get further and further away from equal protection under the law. And once you start carving out exceptions, there's no end to it. Today, it's forced reset triggers. Tomorrow, it's something else. Bump stocks, pistol braces, magazine capacities. They all start to blend together in the eyes of the law when there's no consistent enforcement. And that's what scares me most. Consistency is everything when it comes to rights. If the rules keep changing depending on who's in office or which state you're in, then it's not really a right anymore, is it? It becomes a privilege, something you have to apply for, beg for, or risk losing at any time. And that's not how the Second Amendment was written. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a recommendation for people living in certain parts of the country. It was a protection for everyone, everywhere. There's something especially insulting about this happening in July. We're coming off Independence Day, a time when we're supposed to be celebrating freedom and the sacrifices that made this country possible. And yet here we are, watching that very freedom being divided up by geography. You get your rights in Texas, but not in Illinois. You can have your property returned in Florida, but not in Oregon. That's not independence. That's selective liberty, and it should offend anyone who believes in equal rights. I keep going back to that phrase, trust. That's what hurts the most. Because just when gun owners started to believe that this administration was finally going to take their side, they get let down. And maybe it's not a betrayal in the traditional sense. Maybe it's just another example of political strategy getting in the way of principle. But the result is the same. The people who played by the rules, who followed the law, who registered what they were told to register, are now being told they live in the wrong state, that they have the wrong zip code, that their rights don't apply where they live. That's a hard thing to swallow, because these aren't theoretical rights. These are real people with real property that was taken by force under a now invalid interpretation of the law. And instead of giving it all back, instead of admitting the mistake and making it right, we're drawing imaginary lines on a map and saying, only these people matter. Only these people get justice. The rest of you, well, sorry. But your state sued us, and we don't want to deal with it. So where does this leave us? It leaves us exactly where we've always been, having to fight the same battle over and over again, just with different terms and different tools. The sad truth is that most of these battles aren't really about safety or legality, or even about the devices themselves. They're about control. They're about whether or not citizens can be trusted to exercise their rights responsibly, and whether the government has the authority to determine which of those rights can be honored and when. And even though this time it came under the banner of compromise, even though it was packaged as a responsible middle ground solution, the reality is it still amounts to surrender. Because when you agree to only partially return what was never yours to keep, when you draw up lines between who deserves their rights and who doesn't based on lawsuits and political pressure, you haven't won anything. You've just delayed the next attack. And make no mistake, there will be another one. Once this precedent is established, states can opt out of federal protections just by filing a complaint. That loophole will be used again and again. The legal minds behind these policies know exactly what they're doing. They understand how to build a strategy, one small exception at a time, and each exception chips away at what should be a solid foundation. Before long, it's not a wall anymore. It's a patchwork, full of holes and contradictions and exceptions, until eventually it collapses altogether. That's why I'm not celebrating this so-called win. That's why I'm not applauding the DOJ or patting anyone on the back for doing the bare minimum. Because a true victory for the Second Amendment would have included every gun owner, not just the ones who live in the right jurisdiction. A true victory would have meant admitting that the initial classification was wrong and making every effort to undo the damage, not just part of it. And I know there will be those who say, well, it's better than nothing. It's a step in the right direction. But that logic only holds if you believe the government is entitled to take your rights in the first place, and that you should be grateful when they give some of them back. I don't believe that. I believe rights aren't gifts. They're guarantees. They're not supposed to be up for negotiation. And once we start treating them like bargaining chips, we lose the moral ground to argue for them in the future. That's why it matters that we talk about this, even if it feels like old news. Even if some people are tired of hearing about triggers and lawsuits and ATF memos. Because what's really happening here goes beyond all of that. It's about the quiet normalization of unequal rights. It's about getting people used to the idea that freedom isn't consistent, that it depends on where you live, who's in power, and what compromises were made behind closed doors. And if we let that idea take root, we're going to wake up one day and realize we barely recognize the country we're in. Not because of any one law or one policy, but because of a long string of small retreats, justified every time by words like reasonable, responsible, necessary. That's how liberty dies, not with a bang, but with the slow erosion of principle, wrapped in the language of balance. So no, I'm not angry that some people are getting their property back. I'm glad for them. I truly am. But I'm also angry that others are being left behind, that their property, their money, their rights are still being withheld, not because of what they did, but because of where they live. And if we let that stand, then what's to stop it from happening again? What's to stop the next administration, the next agency, from deciding that another group of people in another group of states aren't worthy of protection? There's still time to fix this. There's still a chance to push back and demand better. But it's going to take more than comments on a forum or frustration in a video. It's going to take people holding the system accountable, refusing to let these carve-outs become the norm, and making it clear that we see what's happening, and we won't accept it. Because trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. And for a lot of gun owners right now, that trust is gone. Not just in the agencies, but in the people who said they had our backs, only to turn around and give in when the pressure came. That's what stings. That's what lingers. So here we are, another chapter in the ongoing fight for the rights we thought were settled long ago. Another reminder that freedom isn't permanent, and that every inch gained can be taken back when we're not looking. But if there's one thing we can learn from this, it's that silence helps no one. The more we talk, the more we share, the more we shine a light on what's really happening, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend it's all okay. And I hope, if nothing else, that's what this message does. I hope it reminds you that you're not alone, that this frustration, this disappointment, this growing distrust, it's real and it's justified. But it's not the end. It's never the end. As long as we keep speaking up, as long as we refuse to accept second-class status for our rights, there's still hope. Thanks for listening. See you soon.